This is Bone Chillers to disturb your dreams. Dare to join us? Click subscribe, ring the bell. But remember, we cannot guarantee your safety from the nightmares that await. Prepare to be thrilled, chilled, and filled with a sense of dread you'll find nowhere else. Welcome to the darkness. We've been waiting.
The Hatman. Evening rain peppered the streets of the small coastal town of Harrow's Point. Gas lamps flickered, casting ghostly shadows against the cobblestones. In the town's archives, nestled deep beneath the local library, Clara sat engrossed in old newspapers. Her latest obsession was understanding the origins of a town myth she had recently uncovered. The legend spoke of the Hatman, a tall shadow figure adorned with a brimmed hat. He was frequently spotted during the town's darkest moments, appearing at the foot of one's bed, just watching. While some speculated him to be a dark spirit, others whispered tales of him being a traveler from a realm beyond comprehension. In the midst of her research, Clara stumbled upon a journal dated from the late 1800s. It was a memoir of Lady Evelyn Harrington. Eagerly, Clara began to read an entry from a stormy evening very similar to the present one. October 12, 1882, I glimpsed him tonight, the Hatman. At first I dismissed his darkened form as a mere trick of the light. But as I adjusted to the dimness, there he stood, tall and commanding, watching me with an intent I could not discern. The stories are true, it seems. A chill ran down Clara's spine. This wasn't some invented folklore. It was a personal account, perhaps one of the earliest. Hastily flipping pages, Clara's eyes landed on another entry. November 5th, 1882, he returns often. The Hatman no longer stands at the foot of my bed. He is inching closer. I have tried locking doors, reciting prayers, even calling for the local priest, but he is unaffected, impassive. Tonight I found a single black feather on my pillow. Feeling a sudden draft, Clara looked up. The archive room's door was slightly ajar. She was sure she had closed it. And then, as the lamplight dimmed, Clara felt a presence. Turning slowly, her eyes widened in terror. The Hatman stood just a few feet away, his featureless face obscured by the brim of his hat. Panicking, Clara bolted for the door. It slammed shut before she reached it. As she turned, the Hatman had vanished. Instead, on the wooden table beside her lay a single black feather. Determined to find answers, Clara resumed reading Lady Evelyn's journal, hoping for a clue to fend off or perhaps understand this entity. December 1st, 1882. Every time he appears, he is closer. Last night I felt his cold touch on my face. It wasn't malevolent, but it was curious. Perhaps he is as baffled by me as I am by him. But why does he visit? Why me? Skimming further, Clara landed on a startling discovery. December 15th, 1882. I believe I have found a way to communicate. When I sing my mother's lullaby, he hesitates. His form wavers. Could it be that he is bound by memories as we are? Feeling a cold presence behind her, Clara began humming a lullaby her own mother sang to her. The temperature in the room seemed to rise slightly. Chancing a glance behind her, she saw the Hatman, not as close as before, seemingly hesitating. She continued singing, her voice gaining strength. As she reached the lullaby's climax, the Hatman's form began to dissolve into a mist, the blackness of his shape dispersing into the dim light of the room. And then, he was gone. Breathing heavily, Clara looked at the journal one last time. December 24th, 1882. Tonight I sang the lullaby with all my heart. The Hatman appeared but did not approach. He seemed at peace. Perhaps he is trapped, lost between two worlds, bound by a memory he cannot place. I hope one day he finds his way home. Clara left the archives with the journal in hand, her heart heavy with sympathy for the misunderstood entity. The Hatman, she believed, wasn't malevolent. He was simply lost, trapped between dimensions, trying to find his way back using the only tether he had, a distant, shared memory. In the days that followed, Clara sang the lullaby every night, hoping to provide solace to the shadowy traveler. And while she never saw the Hatman again, every now and then she would find a single black feather on her pillow, a silent token of gratitude from a lost soul finding his way home.
The Old Hag Syndrome. When Dr. Felicia Turner was first appointed as the head of the sleep disorder department at St. Gregory's Hospital, she was excited about the prospect of delving deep into the mysteries of the mind. but she wasn't prepared for the surge of patients reporting experiences with the Old Hag Syndrome. One such case was of Miss Janet Morley, a 50-year-old librarian. Janet, with her pale face and heavy bags under her eyes, told Felicia about the old woman who haunted her nights. "I'm trapped in my own body and she just sits on my chest. It feels like she's pressing the life out of me," Janet whispered, tears streaming down her face. Felicia comforted her, assuring her that it was just a manifestation of sleep paralysis. But as more patients came forward with strikingly similar descriptions, her skepticism wavered. One evening, Felicia decided to initiate an experimental group therapy session. 6 patients, including Janet, were selected. They gathered in a dimly lit room with soft cushions laid out in a circle. "Tonight," Felicia began, "we will attempt a collective meditation. Focus on your breath and let your mind wander to the moment when you felt the presence of the old hag." The room was filled with the soft hum of the air conditioner and the synchronous breathing of the participants. As minutes ticked by, a cold draft swept through the room. Felicia, who was keeping an eye on the patients, felt the temperature drop. Her heart raced when she saw, standing behind Janet, a shadowy figure resembling an old woman with a grotesque, twisted face. The figure leaned down and whispered something in Janet's ear. Felicia could see Janet's eyes darting frantically under her closed lids. Trying to control her fear, Felicia approached Janet, but the shadowy hag, sensing her movement, turned its gaze upon her. With a scream, Felicia snapped back to reality, finding herself on the floor, surrounded by concerned faces. Janet was unconscious, and the shadowy figure was gone. When Janet awoke, she was in a frenzy. "She whispered," she cried. "She said she was once like us but was consumed by the darkness. She feeds off our fear and uses our paralysis to bind us to her." Felicia, still recovering from the shock, decided to delve into the history of the Old Hag Syndrome. Was there any truth to the claim that the hag was a tormented soul? After days of research, Felicia stumbled upon an old diary entry from the 1800s, written by a woman named Agatha. Agatha wrote about how she was ostracized from her village due to rumors that she was a witch. One night, consumed by loneliness and anger, she invoked a dark ritual to bind her soul to the world, vowing to torment those who dared to sleep peacefully. It became clear that the old hag was Agatha's restless spirit, feeding on the fears of her victims. Determined to end the haunting, Felicia returned to the group with a plan. The following night, they gathered again, this time with protective talismans and candles lit in a circle. "We will confront Agatha together," Felicia said. "Our combined strength and determination can overpower her." As the meditation deepened, Agatha's chilling presence reappeared. But this time, Felicia and the group chanted in unison, "Agatha, we acknowledge your pain, but it's time to move on. Release us from your grip." The old hag, initially defiant, slowly started to dissolve into a mist, her face contorting between anger and sorrow. As her form waned, a soft voice echoed, "I just wanted to be remembered." The room was suddenly warm, and the oppressive weight everyone had felt for so long was lifted. The patients, one by one, woke up from the trance, their faces flushed with relief and triumph. In the days that followed, the reports of the Old Hag Syndrome at St. Gregory's Hospital dwindled, then disappeared. The group therapy sessions continued, though, as a beacon of support for those suffering from various sleep disorders. But sometimes, late at night, when the moon is hidden behind a veil of clouds, Felicia swears she can hear the faint whisper of Agatha, reminding her of the blurred lines between science, legend, and the realms beyond understanding.
The Black Stickmen. Every town has its legends, its campfire stories that send chills down spines, but in our town, the legend of the Black Stickmen surpassed all. Jessica was the first to see them. She was coming home late from her job at the diner, tired and keen to get to bed. Her route took her past the old Thompson Park, a place she'd strolled around 1,000,000 times in daylight. That night, however, the park felt different. The dim streetlights cast eerie glows on the trees, and there was an uncanny silence. She then noticed something, out of the corner of her eye, a tall, thin shape, almost imperceptible against the night. As she focused, she realized she was looking at a creature as thin as a lamppost, its form outlined by the faint light, It moved, but not like any human. It was as if someone had animated it frame by frame in a jerky stop-motion sequence. And then there was another, and another. Terrified, she picked up her pace, wanting nothing more than to be home. She didn't dare look back. Once inside her house, she locked every door and window. She tried to convince herself that it was fatigue playing tricks on her eyes. By the next morning, the terror of the night before had dissipated, and Jessica tried to brush it off as imagination. But as she shared her experience with her close friend Mark, he went pale. Mark, being the local blogger who kept tabs on everything strange and supernatural, had been reading reports from towns nearby about the Black Stick Men. Many brushed it off as an online myth, something akin to Slender Man or other fabricated internet legends. But Jessica's story made it all too real for Mark. Days turned to weeks, and more people in town claimed to have seen the Black Stick Men. They would be standing near trees, at street corners, or in parks, always at night. Their mere presence induced anxiety, an inexplicable feeling of being unsafe. Mark decided he would document this phenomenon. He went out every night, camera in hand, trying to capture any evidence of these beings. But they eluded him every time. It was as if they knew they were being watched. One evening, while Mark was sitting in his room, he stumbled upon an old diary online that mentioned the Black Stick Men. The diary belonged to a settler from the 1800s who described seeing tall, thin shadows moving in uncanny ways in the woods near his home. The settler had believed these to be spirits of the forest and had tried to appease them by leaving offerings at the forest's edge. This gave Mark an idea. That night he decided he would try to communicate with them. Taking some food and candles, he ventured out to Thompson Park. Mark sat there, chanting softly, trying to call out to the Black Stick Men to make peace or understand their purpose. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up, he felt a drop in temperature. Turning around, he found himself surrounded by 5 Black Stick Men, standing tall and staring at him, or at least he felt like they were, given they had no discernible eyes. Their jerky movements, their silent approach, everything was deeply unsettling. Gathering all his courage, Mark spoke. "Why are you here? What do you want?" The air around him grew colder and he could see his breath. The Black Stick Men started moving, each one bending forward then backward as if bowing. But it was in such a disjointed manner that it felt even more terrifying. Suddenly a soft whispering filled the air, like the rustling of dry leaves. The words weren't clear, but Mark felt an emotion from it, loneliness. It was as if they were beings from another realm, lost in our world, trying to find their way back. Feeling a wave of empathy, Mark slowly approached one of them and hesitantly extended his hand. As he touched it, he felt a jolt, and everything went black. Jessica found Mark the next morning, lying unconscious in the park. When he awoke, he had no memory of the night before, only the sensation of having been somewhere else. The sightings of the Black Stick Men reduced after that night. Some said they found their way back home, while others believed Mark's touch bridged the gap between their worlds. But every now and then, on dark nights, if you squint just right, you can still see those tall, thin figures moving jerkily in the distance, reminding us of the thin line that exists between our world and the unknown. The Dark Watchers of California. Julian had always been drawn to the Santa Lucia Mountains. The craggy peaks, dense with forests and riddled with caverns, had fascinated him since childhood. When he finally moved to California as an adult, he took every chance to hike those peaks. He'd heard the legends, of course, of the Dark Watchers, but he considered them nothing more than old wives' tales, spooky stories to keep kids away from the treacherous cliffs at twilight. One autumn evening, Julian decided to camp out on one of the peaks. He set up his tent on a flat patch of ground, making sure he had a clear view of the sunset. As twilight approached, he lit a campfire and settled into his chair, a flask of bourbon in hand, ready to enjoy the solitude. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, and as the sun descended, shadows began to elongate, creeping over the mountainside. Julian was lost in thought, the crackling fire and chirping of evening insects his only companions. Then he saw it, a silhouette on a distant ridge. It was humanoid but entirely featureless. It just stood there, watching him. Julian blinked, trying to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, but when he opened his eyes, another figure had appeared, closer this time, and then another, even closer. His heart raced. There was something deeply unsettling about these figures. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched him from the distance, their numbers growing with every passing minute. Julian grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the nearest figure. The light cut through the darkness but seemed to be swallowed by the figure, revealing nothing. As quickly as the beam touched it, the figure vanished. Julian swung the flashlight around, finding more and more figures surrounding his campsite. They were drawing nearer, but every time the light touched them, they disappeared, only to reappear a moment later, slightly closer. In a panic, Julian doused his campfire, plunging his campsite into darkness. He thought, maybe if he couldn't see them, they couldn't see him. Hiding in his tent, he held his breath, listening for any sound that might suggest they were approaching. Hours passed. The only sound was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then he heard it, a whisper, soft but unmistakable. It seemed to come from all around him. "Watch," it hissed. The temperature dropped. Julian felt an overwhelming presence outside his tent. He mustered the courage to peek out and was met with a sight that froze his blood. The figures were now just outside his tent, a circle of watchers, their shadowy forms almost blending into the night, save for their discernible silhouettes. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Watch." Julian realized with horror that the figures weren't watching him. They wanted him to watch something. He turned his gaze towards the valley below, and what he saw defied explanation. The valley was alive with shadows, not the stationary figures that surrounded him, but countless shadowy forms, moving, dancing, swirling. They appeared to be reenacting some ancient ritual, their movements synchronized and purposeful. As Julian watched, entranced, he felt a connection, an understanding. These weren't just shadows. They were echoes, memories of the past, playing out age-old tales in the twilight. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath him. From the center of the shadowy congregation, a massive figure began to rise, dwarfing the others. It seemed to be drawing power from the smaller shadows, consuming them, growing larger and more formidable. The whisper became a scream. "Watch!" The massive shadow turned its gaze towards Julian. He felt its pull, an irresistible urge drawing him out of his tent and towards the edge of the cliff. The shadowy figures that had surrounded him stepped aside, allowing him passage. Julian's fear was replaced with fascination. Every step towards the cliff felt right, felt destined. As he reached the edge, the massive shadow extended a formless hand towards him. "B."
The Shadow Man of Doan Island. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town of Doan Island in a velvety darkness. The islanders were well accustomed to the stories that circulated about the Shadow Man. Every generation, tales were whispered from one person to another, embellished with time. Yet the central theme remained constant: the ominous presence of a spectral entity, a harbinger of dread. Clara, a travel blogger and skeptic, had recently read about the legend and, seeing an opportunity for an intriguing post, decided to spend a night on the island. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a smirk of disbelief, she began her nocturnal exploration. Walking alongside the beach, the rhythmic crashing of the waves created a serene backdrop. However, as she moved farther from the town's periphery, an unsettling quietness enveloped her. The soft sand underneath muffled her steps, but each footfall felt heavier, as if the island itself was warning her to tread carefully. As Clara continued, she noticed a drastic drop in temperature. The once balmy evening turned icy cold, her breath forming small clouds in the air. She pulled her jacket tighter, attributing the sudden chill to the sea breeze. But as she raised her flashlight, her beam caught the outline of a dark, tall figure several feet away, standing still. Its shape was almost like a void, an absence of light rather than a presence. She froze. The stories described this exact scenario. The figure didn't move, but she felt its gaze upon her, a crushing weight of malevolence. The ambience was thick with tension, and every instinct told her to run. But Clara, with a spirit of defiance, mustered the courage to approach the shadow. As she neared it, the entity seemed to dissolve into the surroundings, vanishing without a trace. Clara, panting heavily, tried to convince herself it was a mere trick of the light. However, her confidence was shattered when she heard a whisper, carried by the wind. "Why do you seek me?" Her heart raced. Turning around, she tried to find the source, but the beach was deserted. The vast expanse of sand stretched out, illuminated only by the silvery glow of the moon. "You cannot escape me," the voice whispered again, this time from behind her. Clara spun around, but saw nothing. The weight of the unseen presence pressed on her, the sensation of being hunted, watched. Every shadow seemed to dance, every gust of wind seemed to carry sinister murmurs. Realizing she was out of her depth, Clara decided to head back to town. But the once familiar path seemed distorted. Buildings appeared and disappeared, and the ground itself seemed to shift beneath her feet. Lost and disoriented, Clara stumbled through the maze-like terrain, the cold whisper always just behind her. Hours seemed to pass before Clara stumbled upon the old lighthouse. Deciding it would offer some refuge, she hurried inside, locking the door behind her. She ascended the winding stairs, aiming to get a vantage point from the top. Reaching the pinnacle, Clara shone her flashlight across the vast expanse. From here she could see the entire island. And there, at various points, were dozens of shadowy figures, all standing still, all looking towards the lighthouse. The realization was crushing. This wasn't just one entity. The entire island was alive with them, and she was their focus. Suddenly, a cold gust blew from behind her, extinguishing the flashlight. The lighthouse's lantern overhead flickered to life on its own, casting a ghostly light across the room. In the dim illumination, a tall, shadowy figure stood, mere feet away. It was him, the shadow man of Doan Island. Clara could barely breathe. The figure was still, but she felt a rush of emotions emanating from it. Anger, sadness, longing. She finally whispered, "What do you want?" "Recognition," came the chilling response. Gathering her courage, Clara responded, "Who are you?" "We are the forgotten, the lost souls of this island, bound here for eternity, seeking acknowledgement, seeking release," the voice echoed, filled with centuries of sorrow. Clara, understanding the weight of the situation, softly said, "I acknowledge you, I see you, I recognize your pain." The atmosphere shifted. The crushing weight lifted slightly. The shadow in front of her bowed slightly. And as it did, the other shadows across the island began to dissolve, one by one. "Thank you," the voice whispered, fading away. Clara, exhausted and shaken, descended the lighthouse. As dawn broke, she made her way back to town. The island felt different, lighter, more peaceful. She left Doan Island with a story she hadn't anticipated. The post she eventually wrote brought tourists and spiritualists from all over, seeking not horror, but a connection with the forgotten souls of the island.
Thank you for watching, and remember, the darkness awaits. Until our paths cross again, stay fearful and stay subscribed.